talk about the effects of World War I as the Great War comes to an end. First of all, President Woodrow Wilson had a plan for peace called the 14 Points. His hope was to address the causes of World War I. Unfortunately, it was mostly ignored. If you remembered when they had the discussions at the Treaty of Versailles, they did like the idea of the League of Nations. That was included, but the rest of his points were largely ignored due to the fact that Britain and France wanted to punish Germany for what they had done to them during the war. The idea of the League of Nations was to create an international organization to avoid future disputes or wars. During the Treaty of Versailles, we had a few countries present. We had Great Britain, France, the United States, and Italy. As we discussed when we were reading the play, the major powers mostly wanted to weaken or punish Germany. There was something called the War Guilt Clause. Basically, Germany was forced to accept guilt for causing the war. As we read, there were several parts to this. One was that Germany lost land. The idea being if they were smaller and had a smaller population, they might not cause as much trouble. They also lost colonies. Losing land and losing colonies is going to hurt Germany as far as their power and their economy. Germany was forced to pay reparations. Reparations is to repay for the cost of damages caused during the war. If you remember when we read the play, initially some countries felt Germany would have to pay for all of the costs of war. The U.S. stepped in and said that was too much, that would hurt Germany forever. So instead, Germany was just expected to pay the cost of damages they created. There were also restrictions placed on the military that Germany could have. They could only have a police force. One of the causes of World War I was militarism. Germany having a large army was part of that. So in order to ensure that this wasn't happening again, they wanted to limit or restrict the military that Germany could have. Unfortunately, these decisions that were made during the Treaty of Versailles are going to lead to economic and political instability in Germany. Basically, it's going to create problems with their economy, which is jobs and money, and their politics, which is government and laws. You can assume that the people in Germany are not going to be too happy about taking all of the guilt for the entire war. If you look at this political cartoon, I think it does a good job of explaining the Treaty of Versailles. Look at where number 1 is pointing. It shows us that Germany must pay for the war, both in money and goods. Number 2, if you look below that, Germany has to hand over any colonies. And think about, what did they use the colonies for? Raw materials, money. Number 3, Germany could not have a military. They could not have an air force or submarines. Only a tiny army and navy for their own protection and police force. Number 4, the League of Nations was created. Remember, the League of Nations is an international peacekeeping organization that hopefully will help settle disputes in the future. If you look at the bottom picture, it reminds us that these countries that caused World War II, our central powers, are split up or divided into new, smaller countries. Also notice how we can tell it's Germany in all the pictures. Looking at this political cartoon, we can see that over here, this hand represents the British Empire. This picture here is going to be Germany. The hand, France, America, Italy, Japan. Over here it says big 4 pills worth $1 million a box. And these guys are saying you've got to swallow it whether you like it or not. And they're shoving the peace terms, supposedly a big 4 pill, into the mouth of Germany. So what we see here, they're showing us that the Treaty of Versailles was forced upon Germany by these powers. You can see here this giant bag of money. It says reparations, and this large number, and Germany is literally crushed underneath it because Germany is expected to pay for the cost of war.
As the Versailles Peace Conference of 1919 went on, it became clear that the very different objectives of the big 3 leaders could not be met. The result of the talks, the Treaty of Versailles, was announced on the 7th of May 1919 to a horrified German nation. The main terms of the treaty can be divided into 5 key areas. An easy way to remember these 5 terms is by using the Gargle formula, standing for guilt, armed forces, reparations, German land, and League of Nations. Firstly, Germany was made to accept the blame for starting the war. Article 231 of the Treaty of Versailles forced Germany to accept guilt for starting the war and became known as the War Guilt Clause. Secondly, Germany's armed forces were to be heavily restricted. The German army was to be limited to 100,000 men. Conscription was banned, meaning that all soldiers had to be volunteers. Germany was also banned from constructing or owning armoured vehicles, such as tanks, submarines or aircraft. The navy too was limited to a maximum of 6 battleships. Furthermore, the Rhineland, the large area of Germany bordering France, was to become a demilitarised zone. No German troops were to be allowed into this area. Thirdly, Germany was ordered to pay reparations to the Allied powers for the damage caused by the war. The amount, £6,600 million, was an enormous figure, especially as Germany needed to rebuild its own infrastructure and economy following the war. The 4th term of the treaty meant that Germany was to lose a total of 10% of its land. The provinces of Alsace and Lorraine were awarded to France. The Saarland, a heavily industrialised area, was to be run by the newly established League of Nations for 15 years. North Schleswig was awarded to Denmark. West Prussia and Posen were awarded to Poland, creating a corridor of land between Poland and the sea, and isolating East Prussia from the rest of Germany. The nearby city of Danzig, too, was to be run by the League of Nations. Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania were to become independent states. Finally, union or Anschluss between Germany and its traditional wartime ally Austria was forbidden. In addition to this loss of territory, Germany overseas colonies were to be run by the League of Nations, which effectively meant that they were controlled by Britain and France. Finally, a League of Nations was to be established as an international police force to help countries settle their disputes peacefully. This organisation had formed a key part of Wilson's 14 points so that future wars could be avoided. However, under the terms of the treaty, Germany was not allowed to join the organisation until it had proven that it was a peace-loving country. The completed terms of the treaty did not entirely please either Britain, France or the USA. No leader was able to get exactly what they wanted for their country. The result was an unhappy compromise between the 3 victorious powers. The treaty itself proved especially difficult for ordinary Germans to come to terms with. Many historians argue that the harsh terms of the treaty itself are partly to blame for the outbreak of the Second World War 20 years later.
Okay, let's talk about the League of Nations. The League of Nations was created to be an international peacekeeping organization. If you look at the political cartoon here in the top left, we see the League of Nations pictured. They're pointing out a scuffle or a fight situation. The problem with the League of Nations is that it was weak and ineffective. It was suggested as one of Wilson's 14 points to be included or created during the Treaty of Versailles. Ironically, however, when Wilson got home to the United States, the Congress voted to not join the League of Nations. Therefore, the United States was not a member. That is pictured here. You can see the gentleman representing the U.S. standing off to the side just watching. The U.S. was not part of the League of Nations. Also, the issue of will they have a military came up during the Treaty of Versailles. And while it makes sense they would need a military, no one wanted to give up troops to serve in the military for an international organization that did not directly represent their country. So what we see here is while the scuffle's going on, they're essentially just watching and pointing it out. They really don't have the power to do anything. They don't have the power to stop it, and they don't have a military to go in and to stop it. So some of the reasons the League of Nations was weak was because it did not have a military, the U.S. never joined, and they required unanimous consent for any decisions, which means everyone has to agree. Realistically, that's going to be something that rarely happens. So while the League of Nations was good in theory, it wasn't so good when put into practice. We can see that in the fact that we end up having a World War II. We talked about some of the changes and boundaries at the end of World War I. We saw the breakup of huge empires like Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire, as well as Germany being split up. We've talked about nationalism a lot this year. These are definitely examples of nationalism. Some of the newly created countries were small ethnic groups that had loyalty to their own culture and way of life, so they wanted to have their own country. They didn't want to be part of these larger countries or empires. Realistically, though, when we look at the Treaty of Versailles, the reason these countries were created was because the Allies wanted to weaken the Central Powers as punishment for their role in World War I. So we saw the creation of countries like Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and more. Looking at a map prior to World War I and after World War I, we'll see a lot of changes in this region. I think this political cartoon does a good job to explain it. It shows that the emphasis on German punishment by the Treaty of Versailles is going to create a problem for Germany. It's going to create economic and political instability, not just right after the war, but in the years to come. And what we see climbing out of the Treaty of Versailles, think about, who does this look like? We know that it represents Germany because of the hat, but look at the name, look at the face. Who do we see here? That's going to lead us into future discussions for our upcoming unit.